So everybody be on your best behavior because the
Oh,
meeting's
I
now
can
being
turn it
recorded.
off.
No, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold this up and I'm going to ask you, what is this?
Sharpie.
Okay, it's a Sharpie or it's a pen. How do you know that? Well, I will tell you. I can look at it and it has a certain look. It also has a certain sound. It has a certain feel to it. So I'm getting information from all of my senses. It's nice and it's smooth and I'm getting a certain feel for it. It has a certain smell. And this is my least favorite part of the session, is that it has also a certain taste to it. Now, somehow I need to take all of that information and make sense of it and make it into a Sharpie rather than just a lot of sensory information floating around. And that happens up in the parietal lobe. And that is where we integrate information from different modalities and different senses, and we make it whole. So when you think about kids who have reading process difficulties, a lot of times we're talking about parietal lobe issues where things come together to make cohesive wholes and to make sense. Now, we also can look at the frontal lobe. This is the most human part of the human brain. This is where we have impulse control. This is where our judgment lives. This is where language lives, working memory, motor function, socialization, and spontaneity. We know that behavior lives here. We know that executive function lives here. And long ago, when we misbehaved according to society standards and people wanted to change our behavior, what would they do? Knowing that that's where all the stuff lives up there. Well, if you go back to ancient Greece, so we've visited the Egyptians, now let's visit the Greeks. There was a process called trepany, which is rather an elegant way of saying that we are going to sort of drill into the skull and we're going to kind of just flick around with the brain. So what you will see is almost like a little circular saw that's finger length. And if what you can do is you can see this in a Russell Crowe movie called Master and Commander, where they actually sort of drill a hole in the top of the skull and sort of cut parts of the brain. Now, of course, they did not have a map of the brain. Their sense of hygiene in ancient Greece was probably not what it should be. Even up until the 19th century, you had surgeons in bloody gowns and bloody robes who would just not wash between them. But the idea was, if behavior lives there, maybe if we kind of flick a little, we can make positive changes. And that was an imprecise science, to say the very least. Then they moved on to something which they believed was somewhat less barbaric in terms of electroconvulsive therapy. Now, ECT these days is a lot different than the way it used to be way back when. We understood that the brain operated on electrical impulse, so the idea was to run enough voltage through it to sort of reboot it. The idea of sort of Control-Alt-Deleting the brain and rebooting it. Now, that did not work very well. This was not a pleasant process. The smell of it was also not pleasant, and you really sort of bit down on something and they said, go. That was later replaced by more humane forms of electroconvulsive therapy, but also pharmaceuticals, which can target different parts of the brain. So let's take another look. So that's sort of the bird's eye view. Let's look at it, an evolutionary view of the brain. So we talked about the lizard brain or the reptilian complex. This is where our brainstem and cerebellum are. This is our autopilot. This is fight, flight, or freeze. Things like PTSD, anxiety disorder, OCD live here. And you can probably understand why, because they're pretty much fight, flight, or freeze based. Now, over the years, we grew a shell-like shape on top of the R complex, which we call the mammal brain. It's something that we share with most smaller and larger mammals. It's called the limbic system. Very, very important at the age where your kids are now. Also very, very important where when your kids were toddlers. And we'll talk about why that is. But this is where our emotions live, a production of emotions. This is where our memories live. This is where our habits live, and attachments. And if you think about it, we call it the mammal brain again because we share these characteristics with smaller mammals. So we know that dogs, for example, have emotion. We know that dogs can dream. We've probably seen them dream with their eyes rolling around in their head. A little bit of a story. My wife and I had never had kids or a dog before, but when we first got married, we bought a dog, and my father invited us to come visit him in Northern California. So we took the dog with us in a little basket, and we put her on our laps, and we were flying up. And about midway through the flight, I rang the attendant button, and the attendant came over and she said, "What's the matter?" And I said, "Well, we have to land the plane." Now, these were the days when, you wouldn't get in a lot of trouble for saying that. And she said, "Well, why do we have to land the plane?" And I said, "Because my dog's having a seizure." So she looked down, and there was my dog, doing this with the paws and the eyes rolling around. She said, "No, your dog is having a dream." So we know that, and we know that animals basically respond to the way we react to them. They don't have the same cognitive capacity as humans. So if my dog is sitting on the couch in front of a bunch of feathers and ripped up fabric, and I come home and I'm upset, my dog doesn't say, "I know, I'm really sorry about this, but I couldn't change the TV channel. I didn't know where you go all day, and I was frustrated, and I'll buy you another one." The dog really reacts to how we behave. And when we look at moral development in humans, we'll see the same thing. But when we look at the neocortex, again, that is the most human part of the human brain: language, abstract thought, imagination, consciousness, reason, and rationalization all live there. We call this the three-parted or the triune brain. But then that begs the question, how do we learn? We know that there are over 100 billion nerve endings in the brain that process information, and they process sensory information. And when you are engaged in active learning, what you will see is that dendrites or fibers bridge across, and they create synapses. So when we talk about active learning, we're talking about paying attention, we're talking about being involved, which is why it is so important, especially for teenagers, to be engaged in it. Now, at the university, we're experts in passive learning because we have lecture halls that are, you know, with 400 kids sort of in tears, looking down, trying to see the professor, and the professor sort of droning on, and they're not really paying attention. They're just kind of getting it passively. But really, when we're talking about learning, we're talking about active involvement. And when these things come together, they create a neural network. It's almost like a tennis net, or if you were around during the 1970s, like a crochet. And you can imagine that it really almost looks like this, and information gets stored in various parts of the brain. So if we think about this, remember we were talking about different types of sensory data. And if you can see that, that in the middle, it looks like there are maybe 5 branches, and you can think, well, there's something from, now this is not how it works, but you can imagine there's data from touch, there's data from smell, and it all comes together as a net. So the idea is then creating that net, making sense of this, is the process of learning. And the information that comes from that learning is spread across the surface of the brain. It's not like a storage locker where you go in and it's like, okay, where's how to ride a bike? Well, you go up to the 3rd floor, turn right, make an immediate left, and it's a number 72, and open it up, and there's knowledge of riding a bike. It's really spread across the brain. But that's how we learn. We create these neural nets of encountering everything. And it's important because when we encounter something new, we build on these pre-existing neural nets. So here's a little bit of information that lends deeper insight. Learning involves multiple parts of the brain. We can see that through how it interacts with lobes, multiple modalities and multiple senses. So when you hear educators talk about multimodal and multisensory teaching, the more ways of knowing, the more senses involved, the more likely it's going to go into long-term memory, the more likely you will retain it. New information gets stored in different parts of the brain and loosely connected by these neural networks. So you can recall them easily. And the brain is network based. And you can think of the brain almost like Google. The brain has to learn in context, and you search for meaning. And that meaning in that context helps to process new information. I'm going to give you an example. Let's say that this is the only thing that I have in my head. This is my only knowledge. And we just did this. We figured out how we learned it through different senses. It came together as a neural net. It went and spread across my brain. But there I am walking around and I come upon this. So basically what my brain will do is go, huh, have I seen something like that before? Do I have any information on it? So it turns and turns and turns and turns and turns and turns, and it comes up with this. So now you have these two things. Are they the same? I mean, they're both pens, right? But are they the same? They're similar, right? So now what the brain starts to do is it starts to create a new net based on this. So this is what I had. So now I can look at this and I can say, this has a different look. It's a different color. It's a bit rougher to the touch. It sounds different. It smells a lot different. It tastes worse. So basically, when we encountered this, when we first encountered this, we pulled this up, and that's our net. Now we have more information that we weave into that net. So do any of you either sew or weave or have seen a loom in action? So imagine you have that net and you're adding things to it. And what do we know when we create, when we add to our weaves, they become stronger and more flexible and more resilient. So every time we encounter something new, the brain asks itself, have I seen this before? Where did I see it? And was it important? So now this is what I got. Now I have two, and so my net is larger. My net, it has a tighter weave to it, and it is more flexible. So when we talk about this idea of learning in context, and when we talk about the idea of scaffolding, it means that you have to have something to build from. Because if you don't, you're starting from scratch. We'll take a look at that in a second, though.
Dr. Hell, so could I ask a question?
Of course.
So just to kind of process what you just said, and maybe and the parents maybe have a question, because I think that was a really important point, which is you talked about looking at characteristics, right? Like in these two pens, right? They have certain qualities or characteristics. And then using that information, you can kind of categorize and group things by how similar they are and different they are, maybe. It's just part of the learning process to look at characteristics and to group and categorize.
Well, it helps to group and to categorize, but the idea is that the brain always has to work in context. It has to have something from which to build. And that's why we talk about education as being developmental, happening over a number of years. And we'll talk about what happens when people come to us and don't have the background to build from. But that's absolutely right. And I want to make sure that I've slowed this down a lot. So all of the processes of which I speak happen much quicker than that. It's not like the brain just process and fires. And what winds up happening is when the brain is excited by new information that is meaningful, there's a variety of physiological processes that happen. First of all, you'll get the kick of adrenaline. That's the fight or flight it harkens back to our most primitive times. So when we talk about every learning activates the survival mechanism, it does. Not because we're worried about being eaten or not because we're running away, but it tells the brain we need to pay attention to this. Stop all of the other stuff that you are doing and pay attention. So when you are in survival mode, you will see that your digestion slows. The logic rational part of the brain that processes information starts to shut down so the brain can pay attention to the immediate problem in front of it. So you can imagine that if there is a kid in class who is worried about where their next meal is coming from, or they're worried about getting home safely, or they're worried about their parents, they're not going to be able to process any new information because they're still in survival mode. And we'll take a look at the neurochemistry behind that. But one of the things that really factors in here is emotion. So something that you learned or taught that really grabbed you, you will find that you had an emotional connection to it. And we'll talk about memory and how that factors in. Some other things about the brain that are important. The brain is a complex and adaptive system. The brain will find a way. So you can imagine if you are driving down to E3 and you're on the 5 and the 5 is backed up and there's traffic and you're just sitting and sitting, I mean, you can sit there, or you might say, okay, I'm going to get off here. I'm going to take a side street. I'm going to go around. I'm going to go down Market and all of that sort of thing. Brain works the same way. We know that the brain is social. In other words, we learn from one another. We know that the search for meaning is innate. It does not start when you begin school. It doesn't start at kindergarten, and it doesn't end when you graduate from college. We are born with an innate sense of searching through meaning. And we talk about this idea of patterning. The brain always will look for patterns because that's how we define meaning. And we know emotions are critical. What do I mean by patterning? Well, let's take ourselves back all the way to the time of cave people. And let's say we are all standing in front of a hedge and the leaves rustle. We can see the leaves moving, and there's a really sort of a sour smell in the air, and we can hear sort of a a low growl. And every time all of those things happen together, that pattern, one of our friends gets eaten by a tiger. So the brain is always looking for patterns to make sense of information. We know that every brain simultaneously perceives and creates parts and wholes. You'll have people who will say, I'm a big picture person, or I'm a detail person. Uh, Fact is that we are both, and we are both all of the time, but we do have our preferences, ways that we like to learn. Learning involves focused attention and peripheral attention. Focused attention is a lot like what we're doing here. You're listening to me, we're having an exchange, and you are focused on what I'm saying. But you may have other things going in the background in your homes. You may hear side conversations. Your brain's picking that up too. So the brain is incredibly absorbent. So you learn both through what you're focused on and what's going on in the background. We know that learning always involves conscious and unconscious processes. When we are unconscious, that is our brain's time to make sense of the day and to make sense of everything that came into it over the day. The reason that it does that is because when we're conscious, we're always confronting stimuli from all over the place. When we are unconscious, it gives the brain a chance to sort of make sense of what it has gone through, and which may explain some of the strange dreams people have, especially during COVID. We know that we have two ways, at least, of organizing memory. And we know that learning is developmental. Learning happens over time. For this very same reason, we talked about working in context and building on things that we already know. So typically what we do is we place kids by age versus ability. So you can imagine in a school, somebody who may not speak the language or doesn't have the academic language or the processes, and winds up in a grade trying to catch up. because they don't have a context. They don't have anything to build from. So, my knowledge with all this stuff is great, right? But if I get this, I don't have a context for this. I'm going to have to start from scratch, and that takes longer. We know complex learning is enhanced by challenge and inhibited by threat. And there's a difference. Remember, the brain is survival based. The brain likes to solve problems. The brain is super absorbent. It is like a sponge. It is like a great paper towel, but it's built to survive in a dynamic, fluid, and chaotic environment by making sense of the world around it through patterning. It's a great place to store stuff, but that's not what it's built for. So when we say that the complex learning is enhanced by challenge, if there is a problem to be solved, the brain likes to do that. That's what it's built for. Threat is a little bit different. Threat is what kicks us into survival mode. And that could be anything from I'm worried about what's going on at home, or I'm worried that I'm not going to be able to catch up, to here's a pop quiz, or come to the board and explain that, because that will take us into survival mode, and we really can't process while we're in that state of mind. Every brain is uniquely organized, and that is really the premise of something that we call differentiated instruction, where we know that everybody has a unique learning profile and unique learning needs, and we have to be able to attend to those both cognitively and socio-emotionally. Now, memory, so we had a tour of the brain, we looked at the evolution of the brain, we looked at learning. Now let's look a little bit at memory. And memory works just as I showed you, in context, searching for meaning. And what memory is practically is reactivation of the existing neural networks that we have made and building upon them. And that is a process called scaffolding. So all throughout teacher education, people talk about scaffolding. And you can even imagine it. You can imagine a building with a scaffold and how easy it is to build from there with it on it. And this really talks about the importance of redundancy and reinforcement across the curriculum. A little while back, we said you're only going to get about 1%. But if you keep reinforcing the concepts, you're going to get more. And if you reinforce the same concept in a different context, works even better. I used to work for a program called ArtsBridge, where we would send our top 10 MFA scholars out into schools to help teachers teach through the arts, teach difficult subjects like mathematics. So we'd introduce the idea, and you can think of the concept of arc in mathematics, and we introduced the concept of arc in mathematics. And kids were still having trouble. So we sent them out with cameras and we said, go take pictures of as many arcs as you can find out in the world. So they'd come back and they'd describe them. And then we would have an activity where they would dance in an arc or choreograph an arc. And gradually, through multiple senses and multiple ways of knowing and multiple learning activities, it began to make sense. So the more times, this idea of practice making perfect, but the more times we see the same thing in a different context, the more likely it's going to transition to long-term memory. Now, also impacting that is something that we call the neurochemistry of persistence and avoidance. Now, we know that the brain is survival based, and the brain rewards us for undertaking and completing those activities that it believes helps us to survive. Even things like eating and drinking, things like breathing, not so much. That's on autopilot. You don't really have to worry about that too much. But every time that we have positive feelings about a learning experience. So you can imagine you finish a crossword puzzle, or you learn how to drive, or you have a recipe. Your brain gives you a neurochemical reward, sort of a good job, in the form of a chemistry of endorphins, which produce a sense of euphoria, and dopamine, which stimulates the prefrontal cortex. Now, you can imagine that if you are getting this positive neurochemistry, you're going to want to keep doing the same types of things, and you are going to be less risk averse, because your brain is rewarding survival behavior. Conversely, negative feelings about a learning experience produce adrenaline and cortisol, and that puts the brain into survival mode. Now, I'm going to tell you what that feels like. So imagine we talked about driving down to go to visit E3. Now the traffic is cleared, so you're flying down the 5 freeway and you have the radio playing and you're driving and you're probably driving fast, and you hear a song on the radio you don't like, so you look away momentarily to change the station. You look back up, and in the windshield, the car in front of you is getting much, much bigger, and you slam on the brakes. How do you feel when that happens? Tell me what happens.
Positively panicked.
You're positively panicked. So what happens is you get almost like a tunnel vision. So everything goes from your peripheral right into the front. All of the resources, all of your brain's resources are now dedicated to solving the immediate problem. And you are positively panicked. So you slam on the brakes, you just miss the car in front of you. And as you start to back away and exchange a wave or whatever you do with your hands, how do you feel immediately afterward?
Mentally drained.
Mentally drained, probably physically drained. You may feel a little bit chilly. You may feel as though the blood has drained to your feet. You're kind of exhausted, maybe a little bit disoriented, but just not feeling great mentally or physically. That is the neurochemistry of avoidance. That is your brain's way of saying, stop doing stuff like that. Stop speeding down the road. If there's a song that you don't like, just leave it. It's going to be over soon. And that's how that also contributes to our survival. But imagine if you are in school and this is the kind of feeling that you are getting. What this tells you, what your brain is telling you, avoid the places and things that make you feel like this. This is your brain saying, every time you do something like this, I'm going to make you feel awful about it. So imagine going to school every day and falling further behind, and you're starting to feel like that. Anything, any advisement, any strategies, any approaches that I could give you are all rooted in these two things. They're all rooted in the neurochemistry of persistence and avoidance. So we want to be able to do things both at school and at home that encourage the positive neurochemistry. So let's get back to memory for a second. And there are 3 types of memory. There's sensory memory, which is immediate. Short-term memory, which as the name suggests, is in the short term, and long-term memory, the stuff that lasts. So sensory memory, what's that all about? Remember when I was doing all this stuff and I was, touching it and smelling it? That immediate sense that I get, that is sensory memory. It's auditory, it's olfactory, and it's visual, and it's immediate. Now the brain has to make a decision about how to deal with information. If the information is deemed critical to survival, and again, not about being eaten or car crashes, but really what is important at the time, it will filter into short-term memory. So the immediate memory is our immediate sensory memory. And you can think of short-term memory like a scratch pad for information under process. So you need to remember the beginning of a sentence to understand the end. It's about 30 seconds without repetition. It is about a credit card. It is about length of a driver's license or a telephone number. Now, there's something called chunking that helps. So if you look at your credit cards, or if you look at your license, or if you think about your telephone number, you will find that it's not just one long string of numbers, but rather it's 619, 795, 0082. Or if you look at your identification, they may be separated by hyphens, because doing that enables us to process information more easily. So if I asked you what your phone number is, you probably don't have to look into your wallet and say what it is, or your social security number. You probably know that by heart. Now, In the days before area codes and hyphenated phone numbers, we used to run through something called a telephone exchange. So any of you are fans of Motown, there is a song called Beechwood 45789 that is not a computer code, that's not an email address, that is actually a telephone number, because the only way that we could really understand telephone numbers back then is to have an alphabetical equivalent to help us. If you look at telephones, you will see you have the numbers there and you have little letters on top of it where you can spell out things. And that's how we used to do it way back when. And that is why when a lot of Americans travel abroad and have to call somewhere outside of the United States, it's just about impossible. I know in the United Kingdom, numbers tend to be a lot longer. I know that in Mexico, even going into Mexico and South America, it is difficult. But short-term memory, another thing about short-term memory, if any of you have crammed for the exam the night before, so there you are, you're walking down the campus and your roommate says, hey, you know, are you ready for the test tomorrow? And you're thinking, what test? You haven't been to class in the last 6 months. So you run out and you go buy the textbook, and luckily it's highlighted already and you learn everything in the textbook, and you stay up all night, you drink pots of coffee, you go into the class and you projectile vomit information all over the test, you get an A, you come back to your dorm room and your roommate says, well, what was your test on? And what do you say? I don't know. I don't remember, because it never filtered into long-term memory. Now, long-term memory is like a storage locker. It's where we keep stuff, not a lot of decay. 3 functions for long-term memory. You can put stuff in, you can take stuff out, and you can bring stuff back. So anybody who has a garage or a storage locker knows what that's like. So all of the important stuff, don't tell me it's at the front and nicely organized. It's all the way at the back, about with your 7th grade history book and stuff like that. But one of the things that we know about long-term memory is repeated exposure or rehearsals. This idea of practice making perfect helps transfer from short-term to long-term. Encoding repeatedly processed in the part of the brain called the hippocampus. Learning is most effective over time. That's why it takes 12 years basically to get out of school. You can delete through interference or decay. It's hard. And there's really 2 types of retrieval with long-term memory. One is called recall. And that is a complete reproduction. So if you think of a particularly happy or traumatic event in your life, you can probably close your eyes and recall it in vivid detail. Everything to what the temperature was like, the smells that were there, the volume. So you can imagine maybe closing your eyes and thinking about a wedding or the birth of a child or your graduation in vivid detail, almost like it was a film. Now, there's also recognition, which is knowledge that the information has seen before, but it's not as clear. So you can imagine it, for example, if you're watching a TV show and an actor comes onto the screen and you're thinking, I know that guy. I've seen him before. Wasn't he in? So it's not as clear, but it is there. And one of the things that we hope is we can get memories that through multisensory and multimodal approaches, we can get a more vivid recall. And again, memories are not stored in a specific location, but they're spread through the brain's entire surface. Now, here's the most important stuff is that you need to know. It's about the teenage brain, and I'm sure that is of concern to everybody. One of the things that we know is that the adolescent brain is more sensitive to neurochemical rewards than the adult brain is. This makes them better learners, but it also makes them more likely to take risks. And they don't really distinguish between the types of risks they're taking. So, trying a new shirt and, skateboarding off of a building are equivalent. They're both risks. And again, the adolescent brain, because of the way it's developing, is more sensitive to neurochemical rewards. Same with toddlers. So you have the terrible twos and the terrible teens, and you probably are keenly aware of what I speak. We know that childhood is when we begin to develop communications systems. Adolescence is when we refine and hone them. Um, there is a substance called myelin, which is a white fatty substance that help neurons communicate more effectively. You see a lot of this happening during adolescence, during the teenage years. And that might help us to explain why teens can adapt and learn more quickly. So this is a sweet spot for learning, and we'll take a look at developmental nature of learning in a second. We also know that during adolescence, the gray matter, the part of the brain with synapses that makes connections, shrink. But it's nothing to be alarmed about. It's a process called pruning. So the brain has a lot of stuff going on during adolescence, and you can think of as pruning is almost like having Marie Kondo come to your brain and just kind of keep the stuff that's most important, get rid of the stuff that you don't need. Think about pruning as cleaning house so you can run more efficiently. So again, the teenage brain is a lot different. So let's take a look at the adolescent brain and change. And what you see in front of you is a graphic. And what we know from this graphic is that the brain is able to change in response to experience much better when we are younger than as we age, because we lose something called plasticity. So, you may have heard the old aphorism that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. You absolutely can, but it's going to take a lot longer, and it's probably going to annoy the dog, and it's probably going to annoy you too. You will find the best time in life to develop good habits and to learn is when we're toddlers, ages around 2 to 6. That also explains why younger kids can pick up languages so quickly. So it is so very important to start cultivating good habits early on, because they will stick. The brain's more malleable. The brain is more receptive. Now, when we're talking about adolescence and when we're talking about high school, we're talking about the ages between 10 and 20. The brain's major growth tops out at about 28. And that is where you see that equilibrium point there. So the adolescent brain is great for learning. And you will find as you grow older, the amount of effort to make the changes we're talking about requires a lot more. So as you age, you sort of settle into your habits and your brain loses a bit of plasticity. And that is the brain's ability to change. So one of the things that we understand is all of that brain circuitry that makes teenagers vulnerable to risky behavior, the mood swings that you'll see. And next time when we talk about socio-emotional characteristics and behaviors, we're going to go into adolescent behavior, something that you probably see. Now we're going to give you the behind the scenes tour. But that circuitry also gives teenagers an advantage in terms of learning and learning quickly. And we know that adolescents are more receptive to learning and show faster learning curves than do adults, which is great in terms of technology because somebody's got to show us how to do it, and they just sort of pick it up like nobody's business. But this term plasticity, which you see, that is the brain's ability to change in response to stimuli. One of the things that we also know is that the part of the brain that produces emotions in adolescence grows much more quickly than the part of the brain that dampens emotions. So we know that during adolescence, everything is sort of Shakespearean in scale. There's deep sighs and rolling eyes, and one of the K-pop bands broke up and it just sort of ruins the month and nobody understands me and everything's a comic or tragic. And that is because this is a time in life where our brains are growing rapidly, especially the part of the brain that produces emotions and the part of the brain that also has to do with reward systems. So the idea of risk and reward, that is why you may see teenagers engage in more risky behavior. One of the places we're going to go when we talk about this idea of flow, which is, I think, maybe 2 workshops away, is motivation. And we know motivation is the precursor and cornerstone to all learning. And kids and young adults have boundless energy to do that, even though it does not seem like it. But these behaviors, and I think you've seen those behaviors that contribute to survival, must be pleasurable to do in and of themselves. And we know that we are rewarded neurochemically for pursuing these behaviors. We know that motivation has to do with exploring the world via manipulation, doing things, locomotion, getting around, language, and social interaction. They love doing that stuff, but also, so very important. And when we talk about the neuroscience of persistence, this idea of being good at something, being competent, it also has significance for cognitive growth. All very important. When we talk about behaviors and we talk about flow, we'll talk about that. Also contributing to motivation is this idea of habituation and novelty. Habituation is a fancy way of saying you get used to stuff and you do it automatically. Imagine you live out in the country and the only noise that you hear are birds chirping and perhaps brooks babbling. You move to the city and you hear sirens and you hear loud noises and a lot of talk and a lot of cars. And every time you hear a siren, you rush to the window, you throw it open and you look to see what happens. After a while of living in the city, you kind of get used to this idea of sirens. You're not running to the window to throw it open anymore. And that idea of getting used to something and moving on to something new is what contributes to motivation, as does novelty. The brain loves new stuff. The brain loves new problems. So getting through the old problems, getting used to them, responding to them automatically, and engaging the new. What else contributes to motivation? And we'll talk about this more when we talk about behavior and flow. Confidence. Confidence begets competence, begets confidence, and it's all related to the neurochemistry we discussed. Creative play, doing things that are fun, and feeling like you're part of the community. And I don't mean community in its strictest sense, like, I feel as though I'm part of North Park, so I'm feeling motivated, but rather feeling that you belong. And when we talk about adolescent behavior and we talk about socio-emotional characteristics, we are going to talk about the search for identity, the search for self, and really understanding one's place. But all the neurochemistry aside, all of the synaptic activity, all of the lobes and all of the modes, when it comes right down to it, it's the innate sensibility that we have that pushes us. Students and kids and adults and young adults, everybody wants to feel appreciated. Everybody wants to feel confident. Everybody wants to feel a peace of mind, a sense of solace, a sense of well-being. And that's what we've got to tackle before we tackle anything else academically, is providing peace of mind and a sense of comfort. So as you move through school and career and life, we all want to find a place that we belong. We all want to feel some sense of peace. And that's just that's not philosophical or sort of pie in the sky idealism. What it is, it's practical neuroscience. Because if we are not comfortable, if we are anxious, we're not going to be able to move through school or through life successfully. And what you give is the most important thing. The unconditional love that you offer is what is going to help make it through. And when we talk about behaviors, when we talk about creativity, we talk about flow, you'll see this even more. Now, I know we've gone just a bit over time, but I want to make sure if there are any questions or if there are any comments that you get them. But if for any reason, I was going to say you're on your way home. I think you're already probably home, but in case later you go, what was that he said about this? Or, why can't I get my kid to do this? Or I don't know how to, do the sort of the praising. I don't know how to do feedback. Just let me know. My information is here.